Okay, excellent. So I want to talk today is, oh, have we come a long way, baby? And really examining where we've come in 100, and this year's 101 years since suffrage, but also looking forward, what we can do in the next century, what we can look forward to, and in particular, and I believe this very strongly, what we, meaning me, you, everybody who's here, what we individually can do to help contribute to more women and just in general, more diversity and better representation in leadership. So as I go through just a brief introduction and an overview, you can see here on the side, I have this Mentimeter. It's pretty cool. It's a word cloud gathering in terms of a poll. So there are a couple different ways you can do this. If you want to participate, certainly don't feel obligated to, but I'd love to engage and get a better sense of what you're doing, where you're coming from. So what you can do is use your phone, and I'll show you how I do it on mine. Here we go. Sweet. So I've pulled up my phone and I can just click on the scan. Actually, if you move your code over, it'll pop up and say something like this at the top. You can see go to Menti. You can also go to menti.com and use the code I've entered here. You can also, just give you lots of options, go through the chat. And the first question, we're only going to do this twice. So again, if it's something you're not comfortable with, if you don't want to, don't feel obligated. You don't have to participate, but you want your voice heard, right? The first question I'm going to ask you are just your familiarity. What women do you know in politics? Doesn't have to be Indiana, doesn't have to be the United States. It doesn't have to be national. Like, it can be truly wherever. And I mentioned this in the prompt, but if you can use surnames, what this is going to do is generate a word cloud. So we'll get a sense of what names are very popular, what names we're familiar with, which women we really know, and then maybe some that might be surprising. So I'm going to keep going as you do that. Won't take you probably too long, but I am going to revisit it and I'll reveal the results of us as an aggregate. So don't think I've forgotten. I will go to that in just a second here. Perfect. So Liz already gave kind of an introduction of who I am. I don't want to waste time on that. I will say the one other title that's really important to me, of course, is as mother. And I have that picture there of my children. It's actually a really old picture. It's from Christmas last year. But for those of you who are parents of either pets or children, you know, it's really hard to get them to stay sitting and focused at one time. So I cherish that picture. When we talk about the women in politics and kind of giving an overview, I want to let you know what we'll be covering today. It's a lot of material. It might feel very fast, but I'm hoping to give you they say 300,000 level, right? The big picture of what's going on. So I'll first start with a brief history of women in politics. And we're going to go through a lot of history in a really short span, but just to get you caught up to speed, why we are where we are now. And then we'll talk a little bit about where all the women are. That's what I'm going to rely on your input. What women you know in politics, what women you know as leaders, why we don't have more women in politics, which is what we'll address next in terms of roadblocks and representation. And this is where it gets really exciting because I can share with you some of the literature, what the research says, and why aren't there more women in politics? Because, spoiler alert, if you didn't already know, women are chronically and consistently underrepresented. So we want to understand why that's the case. I also don't just want to pose a problem and leave you there. I feel like that's a really uncomfortable thing to do. And as for an audience, I think it's really bad to do as a speaker, but talking about some of these strategies for success. So yes, the research has looked at why we don't have more women in politics, but I want to know, what can we do about it? What are different options, different avenues? And we'll talk about those. And in particular, that's what I'm also going to ask you, what can you do? You individually, what can I do, me individually, to help change this? And then finally, looking ahead. As I mentioned, it's a non-election year, so this is an opportunity to reflect, but also to get energized about the next election cycle. And I am one of those people who, and after one election, we're like looking forward to the next one, but in part because that's how politics works. And really, we want to think about that. Electing more women doesn't just happen every night, but it builds from each election cycle, as we'll discuss. That's essentially the overview of what you can expect to see. Giving the brief history, and actually I'll go ahead and just pull all of this up so you have it. Sometimes it's really helpful. If we go back 150 plus years ago, this isn't exactly where women in politics starts, but it's a great starting point for our conversation because understanding the impact of the Seneca Falls Convention, it really ushered in the dialogue socially in terms of what role women played in politics. Now, I said this wasn't, the exact starting point of women in politics. If you're familiar with Abigail Adams, wife of second president, excuse me, of the country, she wrote to her husband when John Adams went to the Constitutional Convention. She would say, "Don't forget the ladies." And perhaps Johnny was busy with other things. It seemed women were forgotten in the Constitution. And so 50 plus years later, you have the Seneca Falls Convention. And this is primarily white women. There was one person who wasn't a white woman in attendance. That was Frederick Douglass. But otherwise, primarily white women coming together and really analyzing, criticizing, questioning, and challenging women's role in society. And when we think of politics nowadays, I think often too many times we conflate politics with parties or ideologies. Like politics, I think in its most general sense, is public service. Think of it in terms of community. These are people who choose to serve the community. And in the Seneca Falls Convention, right, many of the foremothers, if you will, of the suffrage movement came together and they came out with the Declaration of Sentiments. I'd strongly encourage you, if this is of interest to you, to look this up later because it's accessible online. A quick Google search will render it to you. And it's very short, it's brief, it's easy to read. I'll tell you, I assign it to my sophomore level students and they have no problem dissecting it. But in the Seneca Falls Convention, this Declaration of Sentiments, the women said, we want to be able to vote. That was really important to them. We want to be able to have equal rights in terms of childcare. Right? We want to have equal rights in terms of property. We want to have equal rights in terms of education. And I don't want to get too much into what the circumstances were in the country at that time, but women had very few rights. And many of these continue on. You go to the 1960s, 70s before women were able to get credit cards in their own name. Right? But there were many things that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention. And even though it did not enact direct policy change, right, it wasn't a part of Congress, it still kickstarted what we talk about in terms of the modern suffrage movement. And really this push to get women more involved, to give them more roles, rights, and responsibilities with regards to the social sphere. We can fast forward then, and I told you we're going through history really fast here. We can fast forward to 70 years later, you have the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this is this essential moment in American history, because there was never a place in the Constitution that said women didn't have the right to vote. And in some states, they actually did enable women the right to vote. I lived out west for a long time in my childhood, and Wyoming infamously was one of those states that allowed women the right to vote very early on. Different states approached it differently, but in the 19th Amendment, once that was ratified by the 35th state, being Tennessee, women were universally granted suffrage. And at this point, one of my favorite little tidbits of history here, it was really concerning for people involved in political parties to allow women the right to vote, because think of it. Women are just over 50% of the population, right? Right around 51%. And based on a curial science, if you know, men are often likely to engage in activities that lead to paralysis or fatalities. I've seen my husband put up Christmas lights. I know this to be true, right? They take risks in a different way. And men also biologically tend to live 4 to 5 years younger than women. And add to that war, as Edwin Starr would say, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. But it does create a slight imbalance. There are actually more women in the population at any given time than men. And yet, women based from 1920 were less likely to vote. That was what concerned parties so much in 1920 was, oh my gosh, we're going to double the enfranchised population. Twice as many people will be able to vote. What are women going to do? Okay. Up until the 1980s, women didn't vote as much as men. So in some ways, those fears were unfounded. There was also concern of if they were going to create a women's party, which to me sounds like a blast, in a very well-organized organization. Right? Women didn't. Right? Beginning of the 19th Amendment and for a few generations to come, women often voted the way their husbands or their fathers did because they were influential in those social circles. If we fast forward yet again, now we're going to go through another 72 years. 1992 is known as the year of the woman. And when I show you some of the data, I've got some great charts and graphs I hope you'll really enjoy. You'll notice 92 is this point where the numbers really spike in terms of women's involvement. A lot of times we attribute this to the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings in terms of the Supreme Court nomination, right? If you remember those, but we saw an increase of women running for office. And since then, we can talk about glass and cracks in the glass ceiling. I should add in here in 1984, because that was Geraldine Ferraro. She was selected as a vice presidential candidate for the Democratic presidential ticket. In 2008, remember you had Sarah Palin, who was selected by John McCain for the Republican ticket. And in 2016, you had Hillary Clinton, who led the ticket for the Democrats for the presidential race. can also talk about broken glass in 2018 and 2020. And now here, I'm just giving away so many spoilers, but I get really excited about it. We had record numbers of women running in both 2018 and 2020. And as I give this talk at the beginning of 2021, and we don't have an election this year, I very much hope we can return to this conversation roughly about 18 months from now and say, 2022, yet another record-breaking year. We talk about that broken glass. We're seeing increasing numbers of women involved in government. And even to say that, though they are a majority of the population, they are still chronically and consistently underrepresented in all levels. Here we go, in all levels and in every branch. So at this point, I'm going to exit out of here. I wanted to visit some of the responses you had to women being involved in government. So I'm going to screen share. I see some of the names you have on the side. Excellent. A lot of local, a lot of state representation. And if I share it here, let me pull it up. Awesome. You guys are so great. I did this, I should say, I did this in green because happy St. Patrick's Day. I was trying to be thematic. And so many of the names that we have here, Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, talk about a glass breaker, certainly Hillary Clinton as well, Elizabeth Warren, Jackie Walorski, Harvey Macer. This is a fantastic versatility, a great variety in terms of where people are from, what level of government. If you're familiar with word clouds, the way they operate is the more frequently a name is mentioned, the larger the font gets. And that's what we can see here. I'm a little disappointed I use the green because I realize it's a little hard for people to see. Alice Paul, so we even have historical options too, right? I can tell that we are very well versed in terms of understanding women in politics. So it will probably not surprise you then, as I return to my presentation, that even though we have some notable women in politics, they are still underrepresented. And the data I'm going to first show you is pre-2020 election. So get excited, the numbers generally do go up. But if we look in terms of the federal level, right? Let's talk about Congress or the Supreme Court of the presidency. In Congress, before the 2020 election, we were just under 24% of Congress being female. But again, and talk about consistent and chronic underrepresentation, women are around 51% of the population. Congress is supposed to be this legislative bastion of representation, and yet we know women are consistently underrepresented here. We can look at the Supreme Court, and this number has changed with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and then the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett as justice, but in between there, the number is slightly different. Of course, right now, you have 3 women on the court out of 9, and in the presidency, it's important to note, but I'm sure you all knew, women have not served yet in the American presidency. Notice I say yet, I am an optimist. If we look in terms of the change of numbers, so post-inauguration, you can see that number jumped for Congress. This is where we can get really excited. So about 26% of Congress is now female. That's inching up there. That's certainly an improvement. And we also, I had to add this in here with Kamala Harris, have a female vice president for the first time in American history. Now that's looking at the federal level. Let's go to the state level, right? Oh, sorry, I forgot I had this in here. If we're looking at the federal level again, you can see just general increases from what we saw pre-election to what we have post-election. That purple number here, that kind of the violet, I'm really digging it. That is the number of women who will serve. They are now, so they've since been inaugurated. And you can see a jump, pretty consistent, at least in terms of Democrats, a jump in terms of Republican, and a jump overall in women in Congress. Okay. If we look at women of color, and that's important because as I talk about women being underrepresented, I can't just act like it's a monolithic, homogenous group, right? There's a lot of diversity within every identity, certainly, but especially in terms of women. We aren't all the same. We come from different backgrounds. And as women are underrepresented, women of color are systematically underrepresented, even more so. So you can see these numbers here represent yet another increase, still relatively small, but moving on up. Okay, I got ahead of myself because I got excited. But now let's talk about women in state government. So looking at states all across the board, and then I know you want to know about Indiana, I will share that with you too. In terms of state legislators, not looking bad at all. Women represent around 29% of legislators in states. And I will tell you, when I was in graduate school at Alabama, I used to give talks like this across the state. And we would talk about these numbers, and they were often much lower. This is back in 2010, 2012, 2014. So this This jump has been recent, but it's very exciting. I also have a picture here of the state with the most women legislators. And we actually do have one state right now that has more women in the legislature than it does population. So for me to frame it in a different way, we can say that men are actually underrepresented in the state legislature. There's only one state. In the chat, anyone want to guess which state that is? And if you're looking, or of course you probably know, it is not Indiana, but there is one state in the country that actually has a larger percentage of women in the state legislature than men. I always love doing this as a guessing game because I'm very interested to see. New Hampshire is very high. That's a great guess, Stephanie, but they're not actually the state here, although that first letter is correct. Jill got it. Yes, Nevada. So Jill got it. It is Nevada. Nevada's fascinating. And one thing we can say, when we'll talk about institutional differences, and I am going to get to that, sometimes size does matter. And in this case, we could say the size of the institution itself. Nevada has a very small state legislature. They have 63 people in their state legislature. And so we suspect that part of that, also part of the districts, part of the way the elections are run, can play a role. But nonetheless, Nevada is actually overrepresented in terms of women. Most state legislators, I do have to say though, 49 out of 50 aren't. But also look in terms of governors, 18%. This number has gone up recently, remained a little bit more stable. And then it's hard to measure the judicial branch. I'd be happy to explain why later, but to not waste our time on that. If we look at local government, and another thing that's sometimes difficult to compare, if we're looking at mayors of moderately large to large cities, so those of 30,000 or more, right around 22% are female. Now, I know you want to know just generally how this has increased over time. I'd like to point out, if you can see my cursor, right, between 1991 and 1993, we'd consider a pretty substantial jump. But you can see overall since 1971, and women did serve in the state legislature before this, let me be very clear. Unfortunately, we didn't always keep track of that data. And you'll notice all the data that I'm using here is from the Center for American Women in Politics. Fantastic resource. Highly recommend if you're interested in this, a great place to go. But generally speaking, an increase, we've seen a climb. There have been times where we've been stagnant. And one of the things I'll leave you with later, but just as a teaser, is progress is not inevitable. So we can't just assume because, oh, generally speaking, we've seen an increase, we're probably going to do fine, that's always going to be the case. If you're curious where states fall in terms of this, I know I personally am. I talked about Nevada. Look at that. Stephanie had also mentioned New Hampshire. Oftentimes they can be towards the top. In terms of states that often are the lowest, I mentioned I'm from Alabama. Right? I've also lived in Wyoming. Ironically, I'm in a lot of these states with the bottom 10%, but you can see quite a span in terms of what percentage of the state legislature has women in it. And then you can also see a difference here in terms of partisanship as well. So you don't have to study this, but I just think it might be helpful if you're curious what states are at the top and which ones at the bottom. Some you probably predict, but there might be a couple that you didn't. Now let's talk about Indiana. I know you're itching for this one, right? If you look in terms of Indiana, our state legislature has right around 25% women in it. So again, underrepresented. We're not the best, as you saw in that last chart. We're also not the worst. So there's some room certainly for growth there. In terms of women on the state Supreme Court, easiest way to measure it, of course, Chief Justice Loretta Rush is our representation there. We have never had a female governor, and we're among a handful of states that have that, and have never had a female senator. In some states, you've had one or you've had other. There, of course, are states that have had both, but we have not. And what is truly fascinating to me, and I won't spend a lot of time on it here, but just if this is interesting to you, I'd love to chat to you about it. We've had 4 female lieutenant governors. We have a great heritage and tradition in this state of having female leadership in that lieutenant governor role. But for whatever reason, it hasn't translated to women being successful in running for governor. And so that's a really unique thing in Indiana. Oftentimes in states, lieutenant governor role or the Secretary of State role are seen as that stepping stone to the gubernatorial position. That hasn't been the case for women here in our state of Indiana. So when we talk about why, I've told you there aren't a lot of women, and we ask ourselves why this is, we can point to a lot of different factors, and I'm going to discuss 4 in particular. But I pulled this picture up because if you went to the elementary school that I did, probably didn't go to that one, but you went to one similar, we had a Scholastic poster, I'm pretty sure it was Scholastic, outside the library. And it had a picture just like this of presidents. Now, I'm old enough that, the last 3 men, maybe the last 4 women weren't on that poster yet. But I remember looking at this all the time when my elementary class went to library, we came back from library, went to the water fountain, whatever it was, and looking at this image. And what is very obvious to you now, what was very obvious to me at age 6, was none of these people looked like me. Not one of them. They were all very white, very old, quite frankly. And then, of course, President Obama was not president when I was in elementary school. I'm old enough there. And they also looked mean and mad, like the presidency upset them somehow. This is the image we have oftentimes of people in politics. And I can say that's constantly changing. We see more and more women in politics. You named a great variety of women that you know who are involved. But overwhelmingly, especially when we talk about the presidency, that last crack in the glass ceiling we have yet to achieve, these are the images that young people see. These are the images that little girls and little boys see. And they play a larger role in some of the roadblocks to representations that I'm going to explain to you. So understanding what we know from the literature in terms of barriers, reasons we don't see more women in politics. And I'm going to talk about 4, I'm collapsing in 3 categories here. And the first one is the social barrier. On one hand, this has been eliminated to a degree. So I'm very pleased to tell you that. You'll notice a lot of literature is gold. On the other hand, as this, I'd like to say somewhat of a self-portrait of myself, I feel like this. Most of us women feel like we are trying to juggle multiple obligations. We're trying to play multiple roles, and adding a career in public service is adding, right? That is one more thing. So when we talk about the social barriers, traditionally, I'm going to emphasize that here, right? This is historical, but traditionally, politics was viewed as a man's game. And for a long time, that idea, that perspective perpetuated. So you notice here again, most of this literature is pretty old. We're talking from the 70s, but even the Fleming research, which is still pretty old, being 20 years, nonetheless, talked about how this theory of politics either being a man's game, or I'm going to overuse quoting fingers here, right? Dirty somehow, women were somehow above it. Right? That perspective perpetuated for a very, very long time. And even in older generations, perhaps, but I think my grandmother, quite frankly, believes that it still is. That should be left to men. So there's that social barrier. I can proudly say, for the most part, that's not a part of our conversations, but we do know that there are still challenges within the family and the support structure. What women are expected to do, what roles women play, and where they could find an opportunity for public service to squeeze that in. In particular, when I talk about this, the Lawless and Fox pieces, so this is Jennifer Lawless and Richard Fox, fantastic. Susan Carroll, if you're interested in this, they do great research. And what they found through their research, through their studies, is that for women, right, they're often tasked with a lot of domestic obligations. They're often tasked with a lot of professional obligations, and they don't get involved in politics as young as men. So we talk about that political ladder. I'm going to discuss that in a little bit. If they're starting at the bottom later, you're not going to be able to climb as high, right? That's going to be a challenge. And certainly with the balance of all the obligations, this image here that I feel it summarizes so nicely, that's going to be a big impediment for women getting involved. If we go beyond the social, let's talk about the economic or institutional. I mentioned I'm discussing 4 different things, but I'm collapsing them into 3. This is where you see that here. So on one hand, we can talk about the economic barriers. And we know women make less consistently than men. And we know that is exacerbated. That difference is worse for women of color, for women of Hispanic or African-American origins. So even there, again, that monolithic assumption of women isn't true, but that wage gap still exists. And when you consider race, it's exacerbated. Why does this play a role in politics? You probably noticed, but politics is expensive. It costs a lot to run. And even though you yourself may not be donating financially a lot, you're going to be giving up a lot in order to run for office. You're going to be giving up a lot to serve. We can't pretend that is an equal cost for everyone. For some people, it is far more, and it may be too high. So you have an economic component. I'm also going to add in here the institution. And this was something I was kind of implying when we talked about Nevada, but the way the institutions are organized, particularly with state government, we got a great comparative analysis here. We know that there can be distinct advantages or disadvantages for women. Now, I love state government. It holds a special place in my heart, in part because it's very close to us, and it also makes a lot of decisions that impact us deeply that people don't quite pay attention to. It's not as snazzy as Congress, sure, but state governments, in addition to being close to us, provide this beautiful comparative study, because we can compare Indiana to the 49 other states and say, why are we at 25% for women in state legislatures? What does Nevada have? What does Nevada do that we can emulate, right? And we can also look at West Virginia at 13% and say, what are they doing? Because we don't want to adopt or adapt any of that. In particular, some of these institutional features, the presence of term limits, and this has been mixed in terms of the findings of research, but hopefully when you think about different ways we can involve more people in government, you might consider term limits. With women, it has been mixed in terms of whether or not the presence of term limits allows more women to run for office. And as you process that, let me just simplify it, if it's a complicated concept, by saying, if we had term limits, many studies are indicating that their presence would mean we are getting rid of incumbents at a certain point, and we're opening up new opportunities, new open seats for people to run for office. Right? And in particular, we look at this in terms of gender. The studies have been mixed, though, with regards to gender, because when you have term limits, you're also getting rid of incumbents. Those are male incumbents, sure, but they can also be female incumbents as well. Right? And you're creating the open seats, which are very competitive. There's a lot there too. Be happy to get into if that's something you're interested in talking about with Q&A. Also, the prevalence of the single member districts. So I can point to a state that doesn't have single member districts, and that's South Dakota. In comparison to Indiana and most states, and also Congress, we have single member districts in our legislature, meaning we have one district, one representative from that one district, and voters who live in that district are able to vote. In South Dakota, they have a really unique system called a multi-member district. And so you actually have multiple members elected from one particular district. That has been seen as a way to get more women involved, although you remember South Dakota was on that bottom list. So they've been able to increase the number of women in their state legislature, but it's not a perfect solution either. Okay, finally, the last barrier. I hope I haven't gotten you down too much. I promise I'm going to get to solutions after this. But if we talk about the political barriers, right, overwhelmingly, if you took nothing else from this, and this would be a really short lecture, but I could give you this in one sentence, women don't run. When women run, in every research study, you see the Barbara Burrell, Kathleen Dolan, Richard Fox, right? Everybody shows when women run, they win at the same rates as men. That should excite us. There should be confetti right now. That's awesome. That tells us that there isn't the sometimes systematic difference that we see once women run. But why is there no confetti, right? Why are we not as excited? Why are we still talking about this if it's equal? Well, women don't run as often. Women self-select out. And in particular, I'm going to point let's go to the Fox research, for example, just to highlight this. So Richard Fox and Jennifer Lawless did a study where they reached out to women and men who were considering public office. And they asked them, are you thinking about running for public office? What would you consider doing? Just kind of a full study of these people, of their mindsets. And one of the things they found is that women and men approach this differently. Okay? In the decision factors, for example, men compared themselves to current politicians. And so what Fox and Lawless found is men would say, well, I'm looking at Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I can public speak. I'm not good at public speaking. I can do that just as well as they can. Okay? I'm a better negotiator. I am really good at budgeting. I could be just as good as those politicians. That's how men approached it. Women were comparing themselves to the ideal. This is a dangerous, slippery slope. Women were saying the ideal politician should be very charismatic, a perfect public speaker. They should be proficient in budgeting, MBA level. They should be all these different things, a very long, lengthy, impressive checklist. But let's be honest, if I'm comparing myself to an actual versus an ideal, I'm never going to be as good as the actual. And that was the research. That's what the research found, is women said, well, I wouldn't be good enough to run. I'm not qualified enough. I don't have anything to contribute. So we know that there's this political factor that still plays a role. And again, if you took nothing else, women don't run as much. When women run, they win. We need more women to run. The other thing we can find is that partisanship is influential. The political parties themselves in Indiana do a great job. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have a recruitment mechanism focused at getting women involved, getting women thinking about how they would serve in public office, getting women the tools that they need. We're going to talk about tools a little more in a second here. But partisanship is important. Funding is important. And many women, again, going back to that Fox and Lawless studies, said it was too expensive to get involved. They felt uncomfortable fundraising. For any of you who have worked on campaigns, or if you've worked with candidates, or if you know people in public service, and nobody likes to fundraise. Maybe some people say they do, but I know one enjoys doing the cold calling and asking people for money. But in particular, the research shows women feel less comfortable doing this. And so we know that there's different barriers, in a sense, to getting them more involved. And these are some of the political barriers that we see there. Okay, have I depressed you too much? have we gone too far? I hate it when I talk about too many problems and you're like, oh, oy vey, there's too much there. Let's talk about strategies, because the really exciting thing is that there are ways we can improve. And you've already seen some of the data in the charts I've shown you where you do see this improvement. Is it a modest increase? Yes. Is it an important increase? Absolutely. So when we talk about how we can have better representation in government, there are a few key strategies here that I'm going to emphasize and explore, because another question I want to ask you is what you can do. So maybe start thinking ahead. What can you do? One of the first things we can do is work on cultivating the pipeline. Now, this is going to vary based on what it is you do professionally, what your own interests are, what kind of relationships and networks you have. But one thing the research shows us is that a pipeline of success is critical in getting more women involved. And in particular, we can identify 4 pipeline professions, right? 4 different areas of occupation in which most women coming to public office have ultimately served in the past, right? 4 different industries. I want to ask you just in the chat, if you want to write it, what do you think those 4 industries are? You can offer up one, you can try to guess all 4. So women serving in public office, where did they come from before this? What were their careers like? Yes, lawyers, a couple people got that. Lawyers, definitely, that's always number 1. And that's true regardless of gender, by the way. Education is one up as well. There's 2 more we're missing. So we've got education, we've got law. Business, yes, so business is important. A lot of women come from business. We're missing one more, and this one might feel really obvious. So I will not fault you if you don't get it. Let me say that. Moms, we do absolutely have a lot of moms in public office. Government, yes, government. So to explain this, Peggy noted government here. When we talk about women coming from government, you're thinking, well, what? You're talking about people who are running for office, right? Yes, they've served in government in another capacity, whether in the bureaucracy, whether in working in another administration, right? So we talk about government, law, education, and business. Those are the 4 pipeline professions. So as we can identify, wow, that's where a lot of women come from and they run for public service. Being able to cultivate that pipeline, being to identify, recognize, nurture women early in their careers, getting them to think about public service, getting them to think about what they have to offer, right? That early part is a critical component there too. One thing I want to add, especially if you're thinking, well, my career isn't in there. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not in business. Me neither. That's okay. I am in education. But when we talk about that pipeline, I want to be very clear that that is not the direct, oh, that's where you have to have an experience in order to run for public service. We need more people in other areas. We need more social workers. We need more people in healthcare. We need more people in transportation infrastructure. We need more stay-at-home moms. We need more stay-at-home dads, right? But representation is a problem in government and in so many different ways. So I don't want you to feel limited by this pipeline, but the research and literature shows us that those 4 areas are opportunities to nurture and cultivate more women in public service. I do that a lot. Another thing we can say is educating early. And we know that this is important because I pulled up that poster, right, of the Scholastic poster outside my elementary school. Talking to young women and young men, girls and boys, early in their careers, right? Before they go to college, before they go to high school, about representation, talking to them about public service. I think oftentimes we villainize politics in a way that makes it really inaccessible and quite frankly unattractive. If it's always talked about in a negative way, you don't want to be a part of that. Who would? But if you think about it in serving your community, whether it's being on the school board or being the head of state government or being head of the federal government, wherever that position and opportunity lie, right? Educating early, we know, is critical. And I want to pull out one of the pieces in the research that I remember very fondly when I was doing my dissertation research and has always stuck with me as the mother of a daughter and of 2 sons. There's a great article called Lipstick and Logarithms. It's not actually a political science article, by the way. This is in math education. I'm just going to tease to where I'm getting here. But it looked at elementary school girls and then high school schoolgirls. And one of the things that they noticed in terms of math education was at a young age, girls were interested in math at the same rates as boys. You ask a third grade classroom who likes math, those hands are going to shoot up for girls as much as they're going to shoot up for boys. But something happened. By the time girls got to high school, that number went down. Fewer girls said they wanted to pursue careers in math. Fewer girls said they liked math. And just to give you the thesis, as a spoiler alert to the article, this is lipstick and logarithms I'm talking about here, what they found is there was less representation. Most of the math teachers, most of my math teachers were men, and the girls didn't see themselves being represented. That educating early is critical. Being able to see someone in a position that you might potentially want, but also being able to encourage and talk about, you can do this, you could be involved in this. I'd also just say as a parent, this is probably common sense for us all, educate early in terms of many things, but especially in terms of this pipeline and public service. We want to make sure that we're not just talking about it with our sons, but we're talking about with our daughters too. Thank you. There we go. Another thing that's critical are offering tools and support. And as I mentioned, I'm going to ask you what you can do. Coming from this, what's your takeaway? What's one thing you can do to encourage more representation? This might be it for you, some that I certainly work on. But being able to support people, identify people in your own network, someone you think might be good in public service. One of the things that we know from the research, I know that's a phrase I'm using a lot here, but I don't just want you to think I'm pulling on anecdotes. One of the things we know from the research is that women have to be asked more than men. Did you ever think about running for public office? Have you ever considered serving on a school board? You know, I think you'd be great in the state legislature. Your voice needs to be heard. Have you thought about that? Right? That tools and support, by being able to identify people you think would be good representatives, and perhaps they haven't thought about it. Perhaps you're the first person to talk to them about it, but perhaps they have. Right? And they considered it. They just didn't know if they'd be good, right? They were looking at the ideal. They were looking at the aspirational versus the actual, right? That is something that you can do. You can look in your network. You can consider women that you think would be great in terms of public service. And let's not just limit this to women. This could be for anyone. In terms of offering those tools, our political parties at the state level do a phenomenal job of working to recruit for a larger bench, looking and identifying women that might be interested in public service. Right? There are different organizations that focus on Republican women, on Democratic women. There are a number of organizations that work on nonpartisanship. I participated in the Yale Campaign School for Women, and that was back in 2012. Unfortunately, it's gotten a lot more competitive. I probably wouldn't have made the cut now, but they primarily looked at Republican and Democratic women. I said, I'm an educator, I'm nonpartisan, but I really want to learn. Right? That was an opportunity for me to see what went on behind the scenes in terms of campaigns. So the tools and the support, even just encouraging someone, identifying someone you think might be good and encouraging them, that, believe me, is more than enough. And the ask people, ask yourself, have you ever thought about doing this? Have you ever considered? Would you ever, potentially try? And we know women don't run as much as men. And again, I can't emphasize that enough. If you took nothing else away from this, it's critical. Women don't run. That's the problem. If more women ran, we would have more women in elected office. There are a lot of good reasons, as we've explained, why women don't, but nonetheless, if we're able to ask, we identify, right? We figure out, hey, you should consider running. After this, if you can find 2 or 3 women, perhaps, that you can identify, right? That is really important. And the ask, being able to tell women, like, hey, I think you should consider, they need more of those asks than men do. But it also tells them there's support there, and perhaps support they didn't recognize or realize. This is one of my favorite lines. This is Charlie Chisholm here. Right? If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I liken this to coming off of this talk. If you say, well, this is great. Yeah, sure, Laura, this is nice. It's good to know that we're having more women in public office. We don't have a lot. There are ways we can do it. I don't want to run for public office. What do I do? Find your folding chair. You may not want to serve in government. That's okay. It's not for everyone. But what can you do to play a role in community leadership? Right? Think of it very broadly. It does not have to be an elected office. What role can you play to contribute in terms of public service? I have here again this link, and if you're able to, you can also use the chat if you want. That seems to be working well for us. I don't want to mess up with a good thing. But if you want to scan this link again for the Mentimeter post, let's see if I can, sweet. So you can go there. You can also go to menti.com. Again, it's the same code. And the question I'm going to ask you is what you can do. What can you do coming away from this to encourage more representation, more diversity in terms of women in politics? Now, I know I'm close to the end here, but I did want to share a few more things, and then I want to open it up, answer any questions that you might have. You may be familiar with this. I love this meme. This was posted a lot on my social media circles after the election, but make sure to wear shoes, ladies. There's glass everywhere. We talk about those cracks in the glass ceiling. When we talk about 2018 and 2020, as I've said earlier, these were record number years. We saw increasing numbers of women involved in politics. I'm going to share a little bit more data with you. So if you're hungry for that, you want to see the numbers, I promise I have it coming for you. But I want you to know we have seen increasing numbers of women running, and what you've learned, more women run, the more women win. And this is very exciting in the last 2 election cycles. But as we look at this, we know there's still a lot of opportunities for growth. And I have to add this in here too, with Kamala Harris, you have not just the first female vice president, but the first vice president of color. So when we talk about diversity, I always want to be clear, it's not just women as a monolith. We need diversity of all kinds in public service. As we look at the numbers as a whole, so just to share with you in terms of numbers of candidates. So I mentioned record breaking. You can see here on the left, that kind of light gray color is 2016. It gets a little darker with 2018, and then purple 2020. Very exciting to see the growth here. And just in terms of that growth overall, I mean, when you look at the number of candidates, and these are not women that necessarily won, but the number of candidates, we're seeing exponential growth of women who are interested in getting involved. And that is, of course, the first step. If we look in terms of the Senate here, fewer candidates, but remember there are fewer Senate offices, and it's a little different because a third of the Senate is up every election cycle. So institutionally, it is different, yes, but we still see an increase here as well. And then if we talk about women of color, a chronically underrepresented group, we can still see growth, and really you see a positive trajectory throughout, but I think a specific expansion beginning in 2016, going for the most part in terms of 2018, and then especially here in 2020, right? So looking for the Senate, this is also looking for the House. It really kicks off in 2016, which I hope gives you encouragement. I hope it gives you excitement, but I also hope it gives you the energy and the inspiration that we are on an uphill trajectory, but we need to keep it going. We need to keep that momentum going ahead. And then finally, this promise is the last data I'm giving you. Again, this is all from the Center for American Women in Politics. So I encourage you to go there if this is of interest to you. But you can see here, this incline might seem relatively flat if you look at it overall. Of course, this would be talking about 100%. To be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating for 100% of office holders to be women. I want good representation. I don't know, is that fair relative to the constituency? There's this great line from Ruth Bader Ginsburg before she passed when she said, I don't want to talk about women in politics, right? We never talk about men in the Supreme Court in the same way. We will have achieved equity when we have 9 out of 9 Supreme Court justices that are female. And of course, I'm paraphrasing her here, but nonetheless, this looks flat if you're looking overall. But I hope it, again, goes to that inspiration piece. It goes to that challenge piece. As we come to the question part, I want to see what it is you're committing to. Right? I'm not going to hold you to it, but what it is you think you can do to make this difference, because progress is not inevitable. These numbers are not just going to naturally keep climbing. We can't just sit back and say, oh, it's 2021. Right? It's not an election year. We got enough women in politics. We're doing pretty well. Good job, guys. We did it in 2020. We're set. We can't do that. It's not just going to happen that way. And I truly believe that is not just a party thing. It is not just a community thing. Like, this is also an individual thing. Individually, we have to find a way that we encourage, and not just women, but we encourage people from all backgrounds to be involved in public service. I'm going to talk about, let's see, let me go to the top in terms of questions. I'm going to answer, Marjorie had a couple here first. So she talked about listening to an international program, Women Who Lead the World. What areas of governing do you see that are significantly impacted by women? It sounds cliche, Marjorie, to say all of them. Obviously, women are traditionally associated with what we call the soft policies of education and healthcare, while men have traditionally been associated with the hard policies of war and the economy. But the reality is, women have a unique perspective that needs to be shared in all policies. And that's also why I underscore the challenging this, monolithic homogeny of women are this one big group. Certainly in education and healthcare, yes, women have played a large role in the policy, but there's opportunities everywhere. And the impact on us as a society hits men and women, but in different ways. We have to consider that too. Scrolling through, Sherry asked a great question. She said, oh, actually, I want to do some Marjorie's other question. The executive office holders did go down. They do. Sometimes the numbers, we've generally seen an increase, but that doesn't mean they're always going to stay the same, which I think is why it's important to keep up the momentum. Sherry said, what does research show in women in government give that is different from what men give? Oh, Sherry, I'm so glad you asked this question, because I get excited and I forget to. So the way that women approach governing, and I would imagine this is true for leadership in general, but my focus is in political science. So women approach it in terms of a more collaborative and cohesive environment. They're very interested in group work. They're very interested in committees. They're very interested in that collaboration effort, where men tend to be focused more of on a hierarchical approach, right? More of a, this person reports to that person. Now, leadership theories, org theory, if you're into that, will tell you there's advantages to both, right? And there are disadvantages to both. But I think what's important to underscore here is to have both options is going to give you a better and more fuller sense of what's going on rather than relying just on one. Let's see. I love seeing what you guys are going to commit, talking about encouraging girls and young women. And I would love, again, I won't follow up with you on this. So I would love to encourage you to think of your social circle and ask 3 women, right? We've all got 3 women, right? Ask 3 women that you admire, that you're impressed by, that you think have potential. And ask if they've ever considered about public service, right? Have they ever thought about serving in a certain way? And you'd be surprised initiating that conversation, how many women may say, yeah, I thought about it, but I just don't think I'm qualified. I just don't think I'd be good. Initiating that conversation might make the difference. And also for women who may say, honestly, no, I never did. But there's a reason you're thinking of them. There's a reason you're asking them. That might be a great way to start that conversation too. Well, I thought, you have really great communication skills. We need that in government right now. We need to see that in public service. Yes, and I love that Jill mentions attending a public hearing in the bill of the legislature. I think that's invaluable, getting to see the process up front. Sometimes I have students, so I take them to the state legislature, we're going actually later this month. They're really surprised to meet politicians because they forget that they're humans, that they have ideas and dreams just like we do, that they mess up just like we do, they make mistakes like we do. They associate the ideal, and that's an oftentimes very unfair and unrealistic comparable.
Laura, I have a question for you that I was texted to me. The 4 pipeline careers that you identified for women, are they the same for men?
That's a great question. I have to be honest, I don't know. The research where that comes from is the Lawless and Fox. And actually the book in particular, if you're curious, is It Still Takes a Candidate. That was the sequel to, by the way, It Takes a Candidate, which was making the argument, the analysis that women don't run, therefore they don't win. And so the research from Lawless and Fox identify those 4 pipelines. I'd say overwhelmingly men come from law, real estate, and business backgrounds, but I don't know in terms of, would it be equivocal in terms of pipeline professions? So that's a great question. To my knowledge, there hasn't been research specifically looking at that, but the focus has been, where do women come from? Where can we nurture and cultivate a larger pipeline? And those 4 professions and industries have been identified.
Okay. You said you're going to provide where we can get more information.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that It Still Takes a Candidate text, and I would love to share my slides with you if you want. I included the citations in terms of literature and the years. I highly recommend the Lawless and Fox text. Another book I'd look at, this is historical, but I think it's very helpful, is Barbara Burrell's book. She published in 1990. So again, historical here. She was one of the forefront people on the forefront in terms of the research. And her book is titled A Woman's Place is in the House and the Senate. And I love that title, right? But she was making this argument and this initial analysis to why women didn't run. And much of what she said 30 years later still holds true. So those would be 2 resources. And I'd be happy to share the slides with you, Liz, and you could share those out for attendees as well.
Yeah, we'll certainly send those out to everybody. Can you talk just a minute about your radio show?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Promote yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, when you're talking about the book, I was like, oh my gosh, I have it. The book is very expensive though. If you want, I can share a PDF. I will never make money off the book, but let me talk about the radio show. So I do Positively Politics. It's a show that I host and produce every Saturday at 11:30 in the morning on WICR. And the thing I really enjoy about providing this kind of radio content, it says positively. I'm a naturally positive person. You just couldn't beat it out of me no matter what. But I think it's important because a lot of times our political conversations do become very negative. They do become, I think, oftentimes off-putting for people. If we're saying like, oh, let's look at that 1.9 trillion stimulus plan, it becomes really partisan immediately. But I should add, as a political science professor, as an educator, I think it's imperative that I provide a nonpartisan position, that I'm able to explain things in terms of the research and the concepts and what we know in the literature and apply it to what we're learning right now in the news, but from a different angle. My goal in the show every week is to look at what's gone on in the week in politics. And it does have a positive undertone, I would say, but really to say, you know what the research shows us? It's this. And I'll tell you, the station manager always tells me, don't use the word literature, don't say scholarship. People hate that. But what I want you to know is there's a different framework, there's a different lens to understand what's going on. It's not just, well, this is what Democrats say, and this is what Republicans say. And those who don't care about politics just don't pay attention to it. There's an applicability for everyone. And I try, and I hope, if I'm successful in the show, to give you a new framework to understand what's going on and ask the questions that oftentimes the news isn't able to ask, and provide the kind of conversations and the dialogue that in a short form show and a 2-minute interview, you just aren't able to get into. I appreciate you mentioning that, Liz. I love doing that show, and it's really fun to provide a different perspective in terms of politics, especially when it feels oftentimes very negative and very partisan as well.
Right. Well, what's next? What are you going to do next?
Keep it up. So I'll tell you, I've been doing a lot of research on women in Indiana politics. The Lurleen Wallace book came because I did my graduate work in Alabama. So I was researching her while I was down there. But there is this opportunity. We've had a number of women involved in Indiana politics that truly haven't been explored and studied. I mentioned there, I'm really interested in the women who've served as lieutenant governor. I've had the opportunity to meet all of them at various points. They're phenomenal women. And for whatever reason, they chose not to run, or they weren't successful in running for governor. So I think there's a lot to explore here in our state. And we have, I think, a great heritage, a deep bench, if you will, in terms of women involved in politics that hasn't really been analyzed. So I know that's kind of where I want to go in terms of my scholarship, and hopefully include that for the public as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. We really appreciate it. And again, we will share this information with everybody, and hold your book up again.
Oh, yeah.
There.
I'm not kidding when I say it's quite expensive. I gave my parents a free copy, but I do have the PDF. If you are interested, happy to share it with you. Spoiler alert, she was George Wallace's wife, and he couldn't run again for governor, so she ran. It's somewhat of it's a really complicated story, but I thought it was really fascinating to learn about the first female governor of Alabama. They've had 2 now at this point. We haven't had one here in Indiana.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you to everybody for being here. I hope you can join us again. Have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.